Playing the drums is getting more expensive by the day, and today we are going to cover a few ways to help mitigate that issue. Whether you've been playing for a little while or a long time, it's pretty likely that you've seen the skyrocketing prices of pretty much every part of the drums, from the cymbals to the sticks to the heads, particularly the things that we consider to be disposable parts like sticks and heads. When Ben and I were coming up, a pair of sticks was $5, and even at that point it felt like kind of a lot of money, and I was always trying to find some cheaper option. And actually thinking about it, just buying something as simple as a ride cymbal could be as much as 75% more expensive for the identical item as it was 20 years ago. What this means for us is that we have to keep an eye on what we're going through, because if a pair of sticks can be $20 and a snare head can be $20 or $30, we need these things to last. We're going to move through a few different sections here that are all directed at the idea that we want to save money, we want to make sure that our gear lasts for as long as possible, both the drums themselves and everything attached to it, and make sure that we have as much money in our pocket as possible so that we can pay our bills too. First up, thoughtful purchasing when it comes to buying the gear in the first place. What this really means here is knowing what you're going to want to do with the drums you're buying. If you need really big sounds, get really big drums. If you need little sounds, get little drums. Loud cymbals, soft cymbals. Make sure you're buying the thing that's going to naturally be predisposed to doing what you need it to do. There are a lot of pieces of gear that are hyper specialized and for a very certain thing, not just like stack cymbals or something, but even like an 18-inch bass drum. It's got a job that is in the canon. It's for certain things. Similarly, if you've got a 28, that's a pretty narrow range too. Think about how versatile you need your drums and your cymbals and all of it to be when you're going into it, versus if you're filling a specific niche that doesn't have to cover a lot of ground. This is exactly where FOMO enters the conversation, because if we see somebody we love playing something different than what we have, it makes us want to have what they have. It makes us want to have that sound, have that feel, have that feeling when we play our drums. That doesn't mean that it's right for us to go out and buy another kit that maybe doesn't match the music we're doing, or that we frankly can't afford and have to figure out some way to like fit it on our credit card. This also goes for breakables like drumheads. Knowing what we want to do with our drums, especially in terms of sound, can lead us to choosing drumheads that are going to get us in the ballpark before we even start tuning things up. We've done a fair amount of comparison videos here that involved pretty disparate drumheads, and we get a lot of responses that say, oh man, those sound exactly the same. What this means for us is that we have to get past the idea that it's just about a sound and understand it could also be about durability. It could also be about feel. It could also be about tuning range of that sort of drum head. We need to think about these things again, because if we're going for versatility, maybe the thickest head on the market's not the choice. If we need durability, maybe we don't need to have the biggest tuning range. Moving to sticks, okay, this is a really contentious one. I'm sure this is going to have a lot of comments about it, but if you play in a heavy metal band and you hit really hard and you like the feel of a 7A, that's okay. You just have to know that going in, they're going to break more than if you're using a larger stick, simply just by virtue of the mechanics of playing a smaller stick. Similarly, I know some guys that play jazz with pretty big sticks, and that's their preference. It's okay. But if you're trying to save money, if you're trying to conserve the sticks that you have, consider the job that you're making them do, and then consider whether durability is an issue, weight is an issue, length is an issue, and make intelligent choices there. Another factor will also be what kind of wood they're made of. In addition, if you love maple sticks, understand that they're not going to be as durable as a hickory of the same model, though they will be lighter, which can be a desirable thing depending on what you're doing. One of the ways that we can mitigate issues, particularly with sticks, but also with heads and other parts of the kit, is buying in bulk. There are lots of opportunities to get bundle packs of heads or pre-packaged sets of 4 or 6 pairs of sticks, maybe 4 with a bonus pair in there in some cases. If you know which one you love and you use the same one all the time, make sure you seek out opportunities like that so that you're not buying single pairs at full price all the time. Moving on to Chapter 2, now we're talking about our actual setup and the way that we're attacking the drums with the sticks. First of all, angle of attack, huge factor in durability of heads, also a factor in terms of durability of your sticks. If the drums are angled steeply toward you so that your angle of attack is very steep, or conversely, if you're just striking the drums at a very steep angle, you're going to get pitting, you're going to get damage, and you're going to wear out the heads way faster than if you had a much flatter attack on the drums. On that same note, you're going to get a lot less power out of the sound of the drums when hitting at a steeper angle just because of the physics of the way that the stick is striking the surface. This means that the flatter we go, the better everything is, and it may take some adjustments to your actual technique as you approach the drums, but it's really worth investigating. And if you feel like you're hitting the rims a lot or it's starting to bother you, stick with it, experiment, take it slow. These things don't happen overnight. This can then move us toward thinking about our dynamics in general and how hard we actually need to hit the drums to get the volume and power that we're looking for. For instance, if you're striking your snare drum as hard as you can but not catching the rim, you could have a lot more power with a little less energy by playing rim shots. Additionally, if you're not getting enough power and you feel like you're working super hard to get the sound you want, moving to a longer or thicker stick, or possibly one with more weight toward the tip, could be a complete game changer that maybe you haven't checked out yet. The most important part here is if you're hitting harder than you need to do the job you want, for any reason, it's worth investigating ways to mitigate how much damage is happening to the heads and also to the sticks in the course of striking the drum that way. This also can be a factor when it comes to those of us who have broken a lot of bass drum heads. We have said many times in the past, it's okay to be a person who buries the beater in the bass drum. It's a totally viable sound. It's not any better or worse than playing off of the drum. It's just a different technique. However, if you are going straight through the heads often, consider that playing off of the drum could expand the life of that head rather than moving to increasingly thicker and thicker batter heads. Or consider swapping out the beater because, depending on that, it might be a part of it too. One elephant in the room that does not get talked about enough, or maybe at all, is the longevity of the hardware on the set, the stands, the mounts, all of this stuff. If you're finding yourself cranking down those wing nuts and maybe even using 2 sticks to crank them down, things are not going well. We shouldn't have to do that in order to keep things where they need to be. This means that it's possible that they've been overcranked so much that it's wearing out, or possibly that you need different or more sturdy hardware to deal with the weight of the things that's getting mounted onto those stands. This is particularly true of big boom stands for heavy cymbals, or any stand that you're mounting a large tom off of. And going tighter and tighter and tighter is only going to damage the stands and result in having to replace them, and they are not cheap. Now we've made our way to Chapter 3, tuning and tensioning. What can we do here to make these things last longer? Well, first, let's get away from extremes. Extremely low-tuned tom heads. They are going to get damaged faster because they are not resilient in terms of resonance when you play into them with the stick. They are receiving all of that energy. They don't have enough tension to give you any of it back, and they're going to pit. They're going to start to look like the moon. They're going to bowl out, and they're not going to sound good or be tunable really at all. Consider the possibility of pitching them up just a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit. Experiment with the feel of something that's tuned a little bit higher. Also because a lot of the recordings that we love, if you actually were in the room with those drums, they are tuned higher than you think. I've been surprised time and time again. On the opposite end of the spectrum, over-tensioning the snare side head. They're always too tight. Let's get away from the idea that we need to crank them up first day, because not only is this limiting the possibilities of tuning it later, and we're going to talk about that, but also it's going to give us one version of a sound of the snare drum that we're not going to be able to get away from, because once you've cranked that thing tabletop tight, that's the only place that it's really going to live well. If you go down from there, it's going to sound terrible. Frequent extreme tuning changes. If we are constantly tensioning up and tensioning down and tensioning up and tensioning down the batter heads or the Resos on these drums and playing them in between, we are very quickly stretching them past the point where they're going to sound good at anything but a pretty high tension. And generally, that's the fastest way to completely take the life out of the drum heads. This is one reason why a lot of professionals have more than one drum set. It's not just to have a lot of drums because it's cool to have a lot of drums. It's also nice to know that these ones are smaller and are tuned a certain way. These are larger and tuned another way. Maybe those are specially tuned up for jazz or whatever, so that the heads ultimately have a longer life and you have almost like physical samples to draw from rather than having to retune constantly. This is another instance where we have to weigh the cost of having more drums against the cost of maybe having to change the heads more often than we would if we had more drums. Another way to look at it is getting more comfortable with keeping the drums in a narrower tuning range and working with them that way. The more that I play, the more I find that I'm tuning in a narrower and narrower range between styles, and it's really working out pretty good. Another little invisible elephant in the room is the snare wires. We need to treat these things a lot more carefully than most people do. The main thing to think about here is that snare wires are supposed to be each at an even tension, so we need to make sure that nothing is happening to them in the interim that could bend them, crease them, or do anything to change that evenness that they have when they come out of the factory. This is fairly straightforward. Basically, thing one is make sure they can't get caught on anything, so don't manhandle them, and generally keep them on when the drum is stored rather than turning them off, because if they're loosened, they're going to be laying on the surface of whatever the drum is sitting on and much more likely to get caught on something. For the most part, snare wires will not wear out at any kind of fast rate if you're just playing the drum and making sure that they're not getting damaged by other factors, so they're less of a commodity that you're going to have to be thinking about as long as they're not getting damaged. Finally, we are at the last chapter, maintaining all this stuff once we have it. How do we take care of the drums and make sure that they stay happy for as long as possible? Thing one, transportation. Get cases for your drums. Even just simple bags. The cheapest thing on the market is better than nothing. If you can afford hard cases or something in between soft and hard, I say go for it, because as much as we beat on these things from the side and in terms of like the wood hoops on the bass drum and things like that, they're not as tough as they seem. So we got to make sure that they're not getting damaged in the process of getting them to the show or the rehearsal or setting them up and breaking them down. Please just get cases. And of course, just use care when you're transporting them in general anyway. I have set down bass drums a little harder than I meant to and split hoops. It's a sad day. It's a real sad day, especially if they're matched in color. Like, you can't just go buy that. Next up, storage. Please don't stack your drums directly onto the drum heads. At the very least, put a piece of cardboard or something in between them, but if at all possible, store them next to each other. Just because that weight is putting pressure on the heads, and this is another way that they can get abrasion damage, they can get the coating jacked up from them sitting on top of each other and getting moved around, and it is pressure on them that is slowly taking out the life of the heads again. Now, most drums are made of wood, Wood is a porous material. It's a natural material. So temperature, humidity, all these things can affect them. It's not as dramatic as something like maybe an upright bass or an acoustic guitar, but it is a factor. So if you're playing in an air-conditioned rehearsal studio and then you put them in a car and allow them to sit in 130-degree heat all day and then take them in and bring them into an air-conditioned club, this is detrimental. And it's not going to damage them right away, though it could damage the finish possibly. But all that to say, think in terms of avoiding extremes whenever possible. Extremes of heat, extremes of cold, and extremes of moving from one to the other. Of course, we need to make sure that we take care of the hardware. We've done some videos in the past about making sure that the lugs are staying nice, how to clean the chrome, how to make sure that the stands are behaving properly, all of that stuff. But the overarching view is these things are aging all the time. So make sure that you do whatever you need to do to keep them working well. And as an aside, bass drum pedals, also another thing that we are beating on all the time, but they have fragile components. So the next time you look at your hardware case or wherever you store your stands and consider tossing your fairly expensive bass drum pedal in with those stands, don't. Find yourself any other way to transport that pedal, because if you get to the gig and that thing doesn't work, it's kind of important. We need the pedal. And finally, honorable mention, the biggest expenditure you could possibly have is having your gear get stolen. So best way to maintain your gear, especially maintaining that it's still yours, is anything you leave in the van overnight, you better be okay with not having it in the morning, because the likelihood that you won't is exceedingly high. It hasn't happened to me, but everyone I know has had something get stolen out of their car. So please bear in mind that that little extra amount of energy that it takes to bring the stuff in the house is worth not having to find it all again. Of course, a lot of the things that we're talking about today might be considered common sense. On the flip side, there may be some things involved in this video that you've never thought of or even heard of before. The ultimate goal here is to just make sure that you have your drums, they're working, they live for as long as possible, and that we spend as little money as possible to keep the drumming going.